mean, this is classic conspiracy theory, and pretty nutty too, frankly.
In a free society, everything should be up for debate, and that very much includes history. When a popular historian says that Winston Churchill was perhaps the greatest villain of the Second World War, then you might be tempted to laugh it off, but if he gets 34 million views on Tucker Carlson's show, it will be time to take it a bit more seriously. Every claim, no matter how bizarre, deserves proper consideration to test if it's true or false. How else are you supposed to discern truth from falsehood? And who better to discuss Winston Churchill's record than the author of the greatest one-volume history of Churchill, Andrew Roberts, who joins me now. Now, Andrew, I'm not quite sure if you'd heard of Darryl Cooper before he was on Tucker Carlson's show, but in that hour-long interview, he made some quite serious claims. Now, ideally, we had wanted to bring him here to discuss with you individually. I have a one-on-one debate because surely that's the best way of putting things to the test. But he said that he doesn't want to debate you. We failed, but we're going to try to do the next best thing. We're going to show you the clips of what he said and ask you to respond directly. Before we begin, I wonder what you think of Tucker Carlson's basic point that it can be difficult to talk honestly about people who are national heroes in the way that Churchill was. You wrote a book which reveals many uncomfortable things about Churchill. I mean, when you were writing, I don't know, for example, about his botched response to Hitler's Norway maneuver or things like that, in your book, you do come across quite often Churchill making a pretty bad mistake or making the wrong misjudgment. Did you think to yourself, actually, here was only so far I can go as a historian because I am dealing with a nation's hero?
No, I didn't feel like that at all. I felt that Churchill made a lot of mistakes and admitted to it. He wrote to his wife in January 1916, "I should have made nothing if I had not made mistakes." And actually the process of learning from his mistakes was one of the things that set him above normal politicians and also put him in a position by the time he became Prime Minister in May 1940 where he was a better politician and statesman because of it. So actually the mistakes are an important part of Winston Churchill.
And what about his character? I mean, Darryl Cooper was saying that he was a psychopath, was one word he used, but saying that he was certainly an alcoholic. And, we've seen there's lots of evidence of how much he drank, which by today's standards would ring alarm bells. I mean, it's often said that great figures have got some moral corruption. How did you find it?
Well, I think the point that you made, by today's standards, Winston Churchill can't be judged by today's standards. No historical figure should. They should be judged by the standards of their own time as much as possible. And the fact is that, yes, he drank an enormous amount, but he could take it. He had a rhinocerine capacity for alcohol. There's only one moment in the whole of the Second World War, one day, when he got drunk. And that's an extraordinary thing, considering the pressures and the stresses and strains that he was under. So, and as far as psychopath is concerned, that I think says more about Darryl Cooper than it does about Winston Churchill, frankly.
So let's go straight on to the points he made. He can't be with us physically, but we can bring him on in a clip. Now let's go to his main point. He was saying that Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War.
But I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland. Or just, at every step of the way, like people are very often, I find, surprised to learn. There's a two-step process.
Well,
right?
why don't you just make the case for that? Okay, so you've made your statement. A lot of people are thinking, well, wait a second. You said Churchill, my childhood hero, the guy with the cigar.
Yeah. Well, and the next thought that comes into their head is that, you're saying Churchill was the chief villain, therefore his enemies, Adolf Hitler and so forth, were
Stalin,
the protagonists, right?
Yeah.
That they're the good guys if you think he's a villain. That's not the case. That's not what I'm saying. Germany, look, they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler's chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East, in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that.
His point was basically Hitler was happy with his conquests in the East, and he was all set to sending notes to Britain saying, look, let's not fight, I don't want to go here. But that Churchill wanted war. He doesn't want to fight Britain. He feels it's going to weaken Europe when we've got this huge threat to the East, the communist threat over there. And then he starts firing off peace proposals, says, let's not do this, we can't do this. Winston Churchill wanted a war. He wanted to fight Germany. So let's talk about this point in history that he points to, where he thinks war could have been averted, and it was Churchill who was spoiling for the fight.
Couldn't be more wrong. It was Adolf Hitler who was intending from 1933, when he became Chancellor, onwards, to rip up the Versailles Treaty and to set Germany on a path to hegemony in Europe. That's why he entered the Rhineland in 1936, why he had Anschluss with Austria in 1938, and also why he took the Sudetenland and ultimately Czechoslovakia in 1938 and March 1939. And why he invaded Poland, of course, in September 1939. It was a clear attempt to dominate Europe. What Winston Churchill had been doing all of that time was warning against this with extraordinary foresight. And he also said that it was important to rearm, because he saw one day the fact that there was going to be a war. And after the guarantee to Poland in April 1939 that was made by the British government, not the one that Churchill was in, but nonetheless was made by the Chamberlain government, when Hitler invaded Poland, that triggered a war. And until he disgorged Poland, the British government had every right not to entertain peace negotiations with Hitler, and they didn't.
What about the point that Hitler didn't expect Britain to declare war, that after all Chamberlain had pretty much given him everything he wanted at Munich? So sure, Britain had a treaty with Poland saying, look, we'll come to your defence if you're invaded. But Darryl Cooper says that all the evidence shows that Hitler didn't expect the invasion of Poland to lead to war because he didn't think that Britain or Churchill would carry out this.
Because Hitler made a massive miscalculation, despite having been given this very clear guarantee about Britain going to war over Poland. Because Hitler ignored that or didn't believe in it, that can hardly be blamed on Winston Churchill. I mean, that's Hitler's fault, isn't it?
I guess the point Darryl Cooper is trying to make is that Hitler didn't actually want any more war, that he would and could have stopped there, and that he had no intention to expand to the north or to the west. And it was only Churchill who basically kept pushing it, and as a result of that, brought the World War II to what it was.
Well, the whole fact is that, of course, in April 1940, when Hitler invaded Scandinavia and Denmark, and then when he actually unleashed Blitzkrieg in the West on the 10th of May 1940, Winston Churchill wasn't Prime Minister. So how on earth could it be Churchill's fault that Hitler invaded all these countries? It doesn't make sense. He only became Prime Minister later on, after the invasion of these countries like Belgium and Luxembourg and Holland had taken place.
Right. And the idea that Churchill basically wanted war, that, as you say, he was warning about Hitler years in advance. He was, as you detail in your book, he was like almost prophetic in predicting what would happen. But some would see him as being bellicose, as somebody who you didn't need to go over there and take the fight to Hitler. Perhaps it was possible for Britain to have said, look, we deplore this, but no, we're not going to put any British lives at risk.
He did not take the war to Hitler. Hitler took the war to the West. The guarantee to Poland was a guarantee to an independent sovereign country that had not in any way provoked the attack that Hitler unleashed against it. And so the British government had, which I say Churchill wasn't even in at the time of the guarantee, had every right to guarantee Poland. It doesn't, setting a tripwire essentially, which is what it was, is not a warmongering thing to do unless the totalitarian power wants to trip over the wire.
On the point that Churchill came to power, what kind of regime was Nazi Germany then? I mean, was it? You could argue, of course, and I'm not quite sure if Darryl Cooper does make this point, but it was a bit of, the Anschluss itself. It wasn't exactly a sort of full-on invasion. Perhaps, I don't know, there might be an interpretation saying he wanted to unite the German-speaking peoples or something, but it could have been okay.
That's true up until the 15th of March 1939. But then when he goes into Prague, when Hitler takes the rump of Czechoslovakia and Bohemia and so on, that is far beyond just the Sudeten Germans. At that point he takes Slavs into the Third Reich, something, and of course he had been ranting against Slavs for years beforehand. That was the point at which the West, certainly the British people, recognised that Adolf Hitler was lying essentially when he said that he had no territorial ambitions in Europe beyond bringing the Germans back into Germany. And so that's also the point, of course, that people turned to Churchill and recognised that the warnings that he had been giving consistently, eloquently, not for wanting war, but for wanting rearmament in order to deter war, had been right all along.
Let's go to another one of Darryl Cooper's points. He accuses Churchill of terrorism.
The reason I resent Churchill so much for it is that he kept this war going when he had no way to go back and fight this war. All he had were bombers. He was literally, by 1940, sending bomber fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest, just to burn down sections of the Black Forest, just rank terrorism, going through and starting to, what eventually became just the carpet bombing, the saturation bombing of civilian neighborhoods, to kill, is the purpose of which was to kill as many civilians as possible.
Yeah, the Black Forest attacks were nothing like the worst bombing we'd ever seen in history. The Germans had already bombed Warsaw by then, Rotterdam. They'd bombed open cities. The Black Forest, where, by the way, the RAF had intelligence reports of various munitions that were in the Black Forest. This was not intended as a terror attack anyhow. Later on in the war, there were some absolutely devastating attacks on German civilians. But first of all, the Germans had unleashed this form of warfare, and secondly, it was not intended to be terrorism. And also, thirdly, it was very small scale anyway, because the Black Forest didn't catch fire.
But the bombing campaigns in general, one of the themes that he makes is that the more distance we have from the Second World War, the more we're able to look back on it with dispassion. So I remember not so long ago we had a controversy about Bomber Harris, about should this man really be given a statue, should he really be heralded, should he be really seen as a national champion, when in fact he just sent men in planes to go and bomb civilians. So already we have seen, in the last sort of 15, 20 years, people looking at those bombing campaigns through another lens.
Yeah, but what people don't look at is the graphs, which you can actually see in my book, Storm of War, which proves that the bombing campaign levelled off the rate of increase in war munitions production from going right up to plateauing. And so it was essential. And maybe it's because we no longer have people who remember the Second World War still alive today, who are able to say that nobody knew how that war was going to end, and that you had to fight it with every means you had. And the munitions factories that we did take out were absolutely essential to war production and material. And frankly, it's very difficult to ever, as an historian, see the world through the eyes of people now long dead. But nonetheless, imagine if the Second World War had been won by Darryl Cooper's hero instead of Winston Churchill.
He also had an interesting theory about genocide, not a word he uses. He basically describes it as a logistical problem that got out of control. Here's the clip.
You have letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now? And so this is 2 months into the invasion, right? And my view on this, I argue with my Zionist interlocutors about this all the time with regard to the current war in Gaza. Look, man, like maybe you, as the Germans, you felt like you had to invade to the east. Maybe you thought that Stalin was such a threat, or that if he launched a surprise attack and seized the oil fields in Romania, that you would now not have the fuel to actually respond, and you'd be crippled, and all of Europe would be under threat, and whatever it was, that like maybe you thought you had to do that. But at the end of the day, you launched that war with no plan to care for the millions and millions of civilians and prisoners of war that were going to come under your control. And millions of people died because of that, right?
Just utterly morally bereft, frankly. Some 3.5 million Soviet prisoners of war were taken in the first 6 weeks of Operation Barbarossa. And the idea that the German generals and the German general staff, who were tremendously efficient, it has to be said, had no idea about what to do with large numbers of prisoners is complete tripe. They knew perfectly well, but they didn't care. You look at Hitler's speeches, both public and private, and you realise when he talks about Slavs and Untermensch and so on, let alone Jews, of course he was going to kill millions of them. And that was the way that there was going to be the creation of Lebensraum, living space, in the East, in places like Ukraine and Belarus, where this new master race of German Aryans were going to live and rule for 1,000 years. The idea that the deaths of Soviet prisoners of war was some kind of an accident because of lack of foresight is complete rot.
But what about the letters that Darryl Cooper cites of German commanders saying, look, we hadn't quite worked this out, this is a logistical problem, we've taken all these guys prisoners, we don't know what to do with them. He sort of presents a kind of logical...
These are captains and majors. They weren't allowed into the overall strategic thinking of Hitler and his immediate lieutenants.
Another point he makes is Churchill's motives, suggesting, of course, that he was perhaps controlled but by higher forces. He doesn't quite say who they are.
He sort of does, doesn't he? Because, listen to the clip.
But then as time goes on, you read stories about Churchill going bankrupt and needing money, getting bailed out by people who shared his interests, in terms of Zionism, but also his hostility, I think his hostility put it this way, I think his hostility to Germany was real. I don't think that he necessarily had to be bribed to have that feeling. But, I think he was, to an extent, put in place by people, the financiers, by a media complex that wanted to make sure that he was the guy who, who was representing Britain in that conflict for a reason.
I mean, this is classic conspiracy theory, and pretty nutty too, frankly. The idea that Winston Churchill, a man of so much self-belief and who had an entire political philosophy, was going to be bribed by Zionist financiers and the media complex. By the way, what was the media complex? You had some very good anti-appeasement magazines like the Spectator, but overall the newspapers in the 1930s ridiculed and mocked Winston Churchill because they were totally opposed to his stance on appeasement. And it wasn't until the invasion of Prague that we mentioned earlier in the March of 1939 that the newspapers came round to support Churchill and try to get him into the cabinet, which didn't, of course, happen until the outbreak of war in September 1939. But the phrase about Zionist financiers is a dog whistle, frankly, an anti-Semitic dog whistle. And the problem with it, apart from how loathsome it is in and of itself, is actually it's also completely untrue, not least because the financiers who did support him, people like Bernie Baruch and Sir Henry Strakosch, were not Zionists. So what he's really saying is Jewish financiers, and I think we all can recognise what that's all about. And might I also point out that one of the people who has said that he's thrilled that his ideas are now in the mainstream and asking for recognition he tweeted this morning, is David Irving.
Right. Now, we mentioned David Irving, but this is one of the examples Tucker Carlson says. He makes a reference to it. He says basically, if you contradict the official narrative on Churchill, you're pretty much put in prison, you're cast out, etc. Now, David Irving has never recovered from his theories about the Holocaust. But I imagine what Carlson is saying is that how can we be sure we're really getting the facts here of those who demur from what I imagine he calls the establishment narrative are treated in the way that David Irving was treated?
You get your book published. You get, look at Tariq Ali, who brought out a book saying how terrible Churchill was, which you kindly allowed me to review in The Spectator. Geoffrey Wheatcroft did the same thing as well. The idea that you're silenced is rubbish. You sell books. The fact is, you don't sell that many books because certainly nothing like as many as the 500,000 copies that I've sold of Churchill Walking with Destiny, because the books are full of hyperbole, exaggeration, and bad facts.
Now, you sold 500,000 books, as you say, and that, of course, isn't just about the past, is it? There is something about the Churchill debate, aspects of his character, aspects of his career, his long life, very many examples. When people pick up a history book, they are thinking about today's conundrums.
They are, of course they are, and they're right to, because a lot of what Winston Churchill warned about still exists. And that is one area where I do agree with Tucker Carlson. Which is that, of course, it's impossible to look at things like Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the invasion by a totalitarian power against an unprovoked invasion against a democracy, a neighbouring democracy, without having a few sparks of memory that are lit in one's mind about places like Czechoslovakia and Belgium and Denmark and Norway and so on. So, of course, there are historical echoes there. But what Carlson and Cooper do is to squeeze their beliefs, their pro-Putin beliefs in this case, which had already been established pretty well by Tucker Carlson, into the past, and to sort of force their present-day ideological beliefs into a view of the past, which the historical facts just simply don't permit.
So what space is there then for revisionism in the Second World War? I mean, we're going to be looking... I guess Darryl Cooper's point was you are going to be asking more difficult questions. Now, to talk about the Holocaust is incredibly difficult, but even if you look at what Hannah Arendt wrote in her contemporaneous report, she caused a huge uproar at the time simply by saying, look, if you look at the architects of the Holocaust, they weren't terribly evil, they were just banal bureaucrats. Everybody... She got a hugely caustic reaction, was at the time, as you say, a hugely controversial thing. But I think it's much more controversial to do what Cooper and Carlson do, which is to ignore the Holocaust altogether. They don't mention it. Right.
In a discussion, in a 2-hour discussion on the Second World War. Now, what does that tell you?
And could it be, though, that the Second World War is an analogy we reach for too often, that everybody's familiar with it? Of course, we're not familiar. I mean, you've written your book in Salisbury, for example, is excellent, though I don't think 500,000 people have bought that. I mean, could it be simply because we are over-endowed with knowledge about analogies of Second World War, and that sometimes we wrongly place them on today's situation? So we take it for granted that if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he's going to come for the Baltic states. I mean, maybe that is just simply an incorrect muscle memory.
Maybe it is, and also one has to remember that at the Suez, for example, in 1956, Anthony Eden thought of General Nasser, the president of Egypt, as another Mussolini. And so you can, which he wasn't. He was an Arab nationalist and so on, but he wasn't a sort of Mussolini figure. And so it has been possible in the past to make everybody into Hitler. And of course that, by the way, I think is also, and you get that in the interview, something that Darryl Cooper and Tucker Carlson are wanting to do with regard to the Iraq War and the Afghanistan war to make this point that not everybody is Hitler. But overall, there are enough historical echoes to make one fear that were Putin to be victorious in Ukraine, he would not stop there. And his own essay, for example, that he wrote, one should listen to dictators, one should read what they say, one shouldn't ignore them and think that they're automatically exaggerating. Look at Stalin, for example, and the things he said and then went on to do. And you get this very strong sense, I think, with Putin, that if he writes a 6,500-word article in which Lithuania is mentioned, the article is actually ostensibly about on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples, but he mentions Lithuania 17 times in that article, then I think it's perfectly legitimate to wonder whether or not Lithuania would be in his sights after a victory in Ukraine, which is another reason why he shouldn't be allowed to win in Ukraine.
Final question. Primo Levi was famously haunted with the idea that eventually enough time would pass and people wouldn't care about the Holocaust, that memories would fade. And that when people talk about the plight of the Jewish people, there was come a point where that wasn't your parents, wasn't even your grandparents. It's just simply not in the memory anymore. And that creates a space for history to repeat. Do you think we're getting to that stage now? When you look at opinion polls asking young people, for example, if they believe in freedom of speech, a lot of them don't anymore. We can see a waning of liberal values. And in many cases, in many spheres, whether it's in social media and others, a kind of rise of what you might call, I don't know, a liberal conservatism.
Or the new barbarism, actually, as it's been called with relation to this very interview, the Cooper. Yes, it does worry me. The late historian and a friend of mine, John Lukács, in a book called The Hitler of History, said that he was very concerned that Hitler would start to be seen as another Diocletian, as a defender of an old order, and that is a serious worry. And what one needs to do, it strikes me, is to go back to the original values that Winston Churchill wanted to defend, and to read, to learn the actual facts, to debate and discuss like we're doing, and Mr. Cooper says he's not willing to do, and to realise again and again, all of these things that we believe in have to be argued for and fought for, because they don't come naturally. And if there is going to be a new barbarism, a new kind of dark age, such as Winston Churchill warned against in his great 18th of June 1940 speech, then the important thing is that we should be intellectually armed, as much as we needed in the 1930s to be physically, militarily armed.
Andrew Roberts, thank you so much for taking that fight to us today on Spectator TV.